So it is time for our first talk of today, which is called A Tale of Two Empires, which some other languages that I don't know how to pronounce properly. And I'm not going to try because we have Andrew here who has a fabulous introduction for himself and a fabulous presentation about those two languages. So if you're in the back doing swag purchases, we'll just kind of tone it down a little bit so we can hear what's going on up front. If you're at the tables, tone it down a little bit so we can hear what's happening up on the front. And we'll get this going. All right. If we're in the hallway, maybe we can get that door shut so we can kind of quiet it down in the hallway too. Thank you. All right.
Testing. All right. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of Mysterium for allowing me to speak today. I've been a fan of the Myst series and the Dunniverse for years and years, and this is the first time I've attended Mysterium, and I'm really looking forward to it. Just a brief introduction for myself. My name is Andrew Miller. I've been interested in artificial languages for most of my life, both in a personal and professional capacity. I have a BA in linguistics from the College of William & Mary, and for the past 15 years or so, I've been lucky enough to do fun stuff with languages, sometimes as a volunteer, sometimes for pay. I have drafted the first translated Klingon version of the libretto for the world's first Klingon opera. Ooh. I've performed Shakespeare in Klingon with the Washington Shakespeare Company. I've given lectures on Klingon literature at universities and libraries, and I've gotten to translate and edit other people's work through my membership with the Klingon Language Institute, or KLI. What I'd like to talk about with you guys today is the relationship between two elements of design, specifically linguistic design, two facets of language, narrative and grammar. In the context of narrative art, such as a video game, film, or television show, an artificial language, also known as a conlang or constructed language, adds texture and verisimilitude to the storytelling experience by presenting the appearance of a fictional culture that is profoundly different from the one we encounter in our everyday lives. Today we'll be looking at the Dunny language, which is probably familiar to quite a few of you already. And we'll be looking at the Klingon language from Star Trek, which is probably the most famous contemporary example of an artificial language deployed professionally in the entertainment industry. It certainly wasn't the first, but it's probably the one that most people think of first when they think about artificial languages in movies and TV. Though I have to say, we're living in kind of a golden age right now. When it comes to conlangs attached to entertainment vehicles, you could cite Dothraki from Game of Thrones, Na'vi from the Avatar series, and most recently a reconstructed version of the Dacian language from the ancient Balkans in Robert Eggers' vampire film Nosferatu, and also the French resistance-inspired Rorman language from the Star Wars series Andor. In each of these cases, the language in question must be meticulously designed in order to fit seamlessly with the fictional world of which it makes up a part. That design process between the world of the overarching narrative and the microstructures of the grammar featured perhaps only in a fleeting moment of screen time. That harmonization between the cultural knowledge of the audience or reader and the professional needs of a storyteller or creative team is what I'll be discussing today. I'll be contrasting these two artificial languages, Dunny and Klingon, on both the micro and macro level, from the sounds that make up the words, to the way the words get put together into sentences, to the way that sentences fit into larger structures, such as texts and even long-form literature. They say that if you know what you got, you haven't got much. And in that spirit, by contrasting Dunny with its elder forebear Klingon, I'll also be arguing for the idea that perhaps the Dunny language is richer in its cultural implications than most people realize. So to do this, I'll be going back and forth between the two, offering examples of how their features might be similar to or different from natural languages like English, Spanish, Navajo, Hebrew, or Turkish, and also from other artificial languages like Esperanto. So, to lay the groundwork before I begin talking about the grammar, let's just answer some basic questions for the uninitiated, starting with who are the Dunny people who speak the Dunny language? The Dunny are a fictional lost civilization of humanoid people, mostly indistinguishable from you and me, who at one point, several hundred years ago, inhabited a giant subterranean cavern beneath the surface of the Earth in what is now the American Southwest. They were, as you might expect from the exigencies of living underground, master rockworkers and craftspeople and scientists, and their entire society was arranged around a system of professional guilds specializing in each of the intellectual disciplines necessary to keep such a complex civilization functioning. But the real source of their power, and indeed their empire, was not strictly speaking rational, despite the hive-like mindset with which they lived, nor was it their monotheistic religion with its millennia-long chronicles and annals of the words and deeds of kings and prophets. The true power of the Dunny was their language, or more specifically, a highly refined logographic register of it, shaped over the millennia by what they called regestoi, the art. This catalog of special characters, known as the Garo Hevti, the Great Words, allowed them to describe parallel universes and especially prepared linking books to which they could then travel and from which they could extract stupendous economic resources. Thus, from the safety of their subterranean capital city, they maintained a transdimensional empire using this mystical linguistic power of unknown provenance, systematic but not entirely rationally explicable. Of course, they also had an everyday garden variety of their language, which they used for mundane affairs, and that's mostly what we'll be discussing today. Having sketched out who the Dunny are, and the tremendous role their language plays in their history, let's ask the corollary. Who are the Klingons from Star Trek? Or perhaps we should start with, what is Star Trek? Star Trek is one of the most successful science fiction media franchises, depicting a united human race living in an economically bountiful, technologically advanced post-scarcity society. In this future, humanity has achieved faster-than-light travel and has allied itself with a number of other intelligent alien life forms around the Milky Way galaxy in a democratic interstellar polity known as the United Federation of Planets. As many observers have noted, the general tone and tenor of Star Trek when it debuted on television in 1966 reflected the overwhelming optimism and ideological humanist idealism of the post-World War II United States. So, if in the image world, the Federation is a proxy for the American project in the Cold War era, we would expect the villains of Star Trek, at least in its early decades, to reflect the ideological boogeymen of the Eastern Bloc. And that is exactly what we observe in the character of the Klingons. Like the Dunny, the Klingons have established an empire spanning many different worlds, but they won their empire using advanced warships in space, where the Federation is egalitarian, xenophilic. Rooted in scientific rationalism, the Klingon Empire is hierarchical, warlike, territorial, brash, crude, braggadocious, and also rooted in apparently Stone Age ritual and tradition. My guess is that Star Trek writers didn't want the Soviet connection to be too on the nose. The other factor here is probably the fact that depicting actual communist doctrine on screen would be boring. So they take the Klingons the other direction, gifting the image of scientific socialism to the Federation instead. But the writers really play up how anti-human the Klingons really are. They're basically space barbarians with ridgy foreheads. They eat live worms and God knows what else. They routinely challenge each other to hand-to-hand combat with gnarly bladed weapons. Their religious life consists largely of tests of strength, physical prowess, and endurance, usually endurance of pain. In later years, the barbarian elements of Klingon culture take center stage, and the Soviet themes are downplayed. But in their heyday, before the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1991, the Klingons compete with the Federation for control over weapons of mass destruction and become the victims of their own technological hubris, suffering a Chernobyl-like disaster on their mining colony called Praxis, wink wink, in Star Trek VI. So it's very clear that for a long time in the American popular imagination, the Klingons were thoroughly deputized as stand-ins for the communist menace, though ironically filtered through a lens of intense tribal totalitarianism and hierarchical honor culture. Which brings us back to the Dunny. Might we ask the same sorts of questions about them? Are there historical precursors or literary analogs for the Dunny people? It has already been observed that the notion of a perfect, magical language in which the purest essences of the things in creation could be accurately represented was ascribed to the Hebrew language of the Bible, or at least to the language used by Adam in the Garden of Eden to name all the animals, which presumably was the same language shared by all of humanity until the confusion of tongues of the Tower of Babel, according to the book of Genesis. Variations on this view are held by such intellectual luminaries as Philo of Alexandria, Origen of Alexandria, Abraham Abulafia, Isaac Luria, Johannes Reuchlin, John Dee, Francis Bacon, Jakob Böhme, and Athanasius Kircher. Some of these figures were religiously and ethnically Jewish themselves, and others were associated with the intellectual movement of the European Renaissance, which contemplated the possibility of the perfectibility of mankind, whether through reason or true religion, or some combination of the two. So the concept of a language that can enact real change in the world by its mere utterance has a long and venerable intellectual pedigree. But that's just the linguistic dimension. What about the element of the lost subterranean civilization, perhaps in some respects more advanced than our own? Though not buried under the earth, you can't really discuss this theme without mentioning Plato's myth of Atlantis, for the Disney version of which, hey presto, Mark Okrand, who created Klingon, also designed a language once upon a time. From broadly speaking Eastern mythology, we also have Agartha or Agarti, first mentioned in the West by the travel writer Ferdinand Ossendowski in his Beasts, Men, and Gods, but probably strongly influenced by the Hindu mythological realm of Patala or Patala Loka, peopled by Nagas, serpent beings, and other fierce and beautiful creatures abiding in profound peace, wisdom, and aesthetic finery. In more recent Western literature, these themes find realization in Edward Bulwer Lytton's fiction, as well as the works of Mary Lane, Willis George Emerson, Edgar Rice Burroughs, H.P. Lovecraft, and Arthur Conan Doyle, to say nothing of the dwarves of J.R.R. Tolkien and their Mines of Moria. So both these subterranean and linguistic tropes are well established in literary history. The Dunny exist, so to speak, at the sweet spot between them. They are spiritually and technologically sophisticated underground dwellers who possess a secret code that allows them to create portals to new worlds via a perfect descriptive art, subsequently lost with the fall of their civilization, just as the mythologically perfect language of Adam and Eve was lost at Babel. So now that we have the narrative and intellectual background for both the Klingon and Dunny cultures and some of the very real historical ideas on which they're based, let's have a look at what makes these languages tick on the micro level, and then circle back from time to time to explain how these words, features, and grammatical structures resonate with the cultural themes already outlined. I won't rehash the full real-world story of the Klingon language itself, since there are already plenty of interviews and YouTube videos out there in which Mark Okrand recounts the story. It's a great story, but in the interest of time, we'll dive right into the most important thing to know about Klingon, and that's that it was never intended to be used at home by fans. The producers of the film Star Trek III conceived of it as a tool to convey a sense of realism for their Soviet submarine movie in space. Actors, not fans, were the first Klingon speakers, and for this reason, several features of the language were designed with actors in mind. One of these is the distinctive mixed case orthography. Capitalization is always phonetic when Klingon is transcribed in the English alphabet, and sometimes only the capital version of a letter will ever appear in a Klingon text. Capitals indicate that the sound transcribed by the letter is not what the reader might expect, which is an easy mnemonic for actors whose time to internalize the many different aspects of their performance is limited. For instance, capital D and S represent D and sh, respectively. These are retroflex sounds produced by bending the tongue back in the mouth at the point of articulation. Capital H represents the velar fricative ch, known from Russian and also Scots English and German. Capital I stands for the E in bit as opposed to beat. Klingon also distinguishes between a lowercase q and a capital Q. Little q is the uvular plosive ka, found in Arabic and the Inuit languages. Big Q is probably the rarest sound in Klingon, the uvular affricate ka, but it is known to exist in the Avar and Uzbek languages. So, for example, we have dud, to mix, shish, to rain, hot, to scan, ho, tooth, truk, tail. Other notable sounds include ra, which is the voiced version of cha, tla, an affricate documented in the Aztec languages, and the glottal stop, also found in Arabic, Hawaiian, and the English word uh-oh. So just from this brief review of some of the sounds, we can see the design constraints at work. The language in the original script is designed as guttural, which is not a technical linguistic term, but basically refers to the lower part of the vocal tract. So we get ra, cha, ka, ka, but no K sound. Indeed, we'll see later that Klingon is defined just as much by what it doesn't do as much as by what it does differently, being created to be different from all Earth languages generally and English in particular. By contrast, the Dunny sound system is a bit more Earthling-friendly and familiar and takes a few sounds from its inspiration, Hebrew. One of these is the sound it shares with Klingon, the velar fricative ch, which we can observe in cha, few, och, of, vilech, misery, shochu, instruction. Another Hebrew sound is the dental affricate ts, as in tsan, always, tsar, go, vogets, natural, pats, city, vetsu, presence. Klingon and Dunny also share a feature, what we might informally call the sci-fi fantasy apostrophe, which is often deployed by creators of speculative fiction in order to make their creations seem more exotic. In Klingon, the apostrophe is always a glottal stop. It, armpit. U, universe. Akren, professor, master. Iktoi, parody, caricature. In Dunny, the apostrophe can be pronounced as a schwa in the word Dunny itself, or damala, come back, kutsi, happy, kutesh, entertain. Sometimes it represents an elided vowel or demarcates the boundary between a root and its prefixes and suffixes. So mor och mor, grandmother, vetsuon, his presence, re'etste, the retribution, which contains both kinds of apostrophes. Speaking of the vagaries of transcription, Dunny is also written natively in this beautiful, flowing alphabetic script, truly a masterpiece of typographic design. The Dunny system differs from Hebrew and Perso-Arabic and other graphical inspirations in that it is a true alphabet in which vowels are full letters unto themselves. Systems known as abjads, like Hebrew, on the other hand, only notate short vowels when necessary, and in most ordinary contexts, only long vowels are actually written. Another shared attribute is that these are all, to some degree, featural systems, meaning that features of the sounds themselves are notated in individual letters. So in Hebrew, we can notate the difference between bet and vet, right up there. And this is just Arabic, but if this letter had 3 dots underneath it, it would be a P instead of a B. The addition of 1 or 2 extra strokes, Dunny does something similar, indicating variations on related vowels with a horizontal stroke. Bring it back. So you have J, which is the soft sound, and G, which is the hard sound, Ch, which is the soft sound, K, which is the hard sound. Klingon also has its own writing system called Picard, which is based on the mostly meaningless but also visually striking glyphs created by longtime Star Trek set designer Michael Okuda. These have since been repurposed and assigned phonetic values, at first by the community of speakers, and ever since then, Mark Okrand himself and also Star Trek officialdom have deployed this mapping of sounds for letters in public-facing projects. This alphabet is not used nearly as much as the English alphabet transcription for the simple reason that there is no convenient way to type messages in Picard in a Unicode-based system. So Picard is mostly used for graphic art projects by Klingonists. Since we're getting into the very basics of these structural differences between these languages, now seems like a good time to point out that though Dunny is partially inspired by Hebrew, just as Klingon is partially inspired by Russian, and also certain North American languages, as we'll see later, these two artificial languages are morphologically distinct from their spiritual predecessors. By this I just mean that the way the words and phrases work and relate to each other are noticeably quite different. Hebrew, as a Semitic language like Arabic, Amharic, and Akkadian, possesses a feature that Dunny does not have, which is a system of triliteral or consonantal roots. In other words, a set of letters, usually 3 in number, usually consonants, which provide the information that gives the general concept of a word. By adding various vowels, prefixes, suffixes, and infixes, the speaker creates functional variations on that concept. So to give 2 examples, the root kaf, teth, bet in Hebrew, which is up there, denotes writing. The noun ketuvim, with the plural suffix and certain internal vowels, means writings. Kotev, with different vowels, means a writer, and lechtov is the infinitive of the verb to write. Similarly, the root bet resh kaf carries the meaning of to bless, and a bracha constitutes the noun blessing. Baruch is the adjective meaning blessed, and levrech is the infinitive of the verb. And this is a major structural feature that generalizes among the entire family of languages. So you've got examples up there from both Hebrew and Arabic. Dunny does not actually work this way, because of course Dunny is not a Semitic language. Dunny roots overwhelmingly contain fixed vowels that do not vary regardless of the role the root is playing. You can stack prefixes and suffixes onto a Dunny root, but the internal vowels remain the same. So example, we have the verb paboy in Dunny, which means bless, first person singular, present tense, I bless. To form nouns of this verb, we can add the suffixes tan and tav. A paboy tan is a blesser, one who blesses, and a paboy tav is a blessing. We also have the 2 Dunny verbs, sel and gel, both of which mean to write, one in the ordinary sense of recording in textual form, and the second in the sense of the mystic art that allows for the description of and travel to other dimensions called ages. Both of these verbs can receive prefixes and suffixes to indicate person, tense, and class shift. So, Seltan is an ordinary writer, Geltan, a writer of ages, Seltavti, writings in the plural, Geltavti, age writings in the plural. So you tack on the suffix. You don't have to change anything internal to the root like you might in Hebrew. This pattern holds for almost all known Dunny roots, although there are some exceptions. We're going to put an asterisk here and come back later when we have more background. If Dunny is inspired by Hebrew primarily thematically, graphically, and in the sound system, what can we say about the relationship between Russian and Klingon? Is there a deeper relationship between these two? To my observation, there mostly is not. The situation is similar. Despite the abstract, imagistic cultural debt that Klingons owe to the Cold War, morphologically the Klingon language resembles Russian very little. We would describe Russian as inflected or fusional. A single morpheme or discrete meaning-bearing part of a word, usually a suffix, contains all the information a speaker wishes to convey about the gender number and case, or thematic role, what the noun is doing in the sentence, if you're talking about a noun, and person, number, tense, and mood of a verb. Russian adjectives modifying nouns must agree with them in case, number, and gender, and change their single suffix endings to suit this context. In Klingon, however, instead of a single ending that tells you all of this information, Klingon nouns consist of a root followed by up to 5 distinct categories of suffixes, all categories of which may be included or omitted as the situation requires. So these examples of suffixes can be used to produce the words pakwijdak, in my book, pakhe, something that looks like a book, pakhomechedwijdak, in what look like my booklets. Klingon may not have grammatical gender per se, which in Indo-European languages like Russian usually manifests as a tripartite system of masculine, feminine, and neuter nouns and adjectives. But it does have what are called noun classes, which amount to a different categorical breakdown of the ways noun phrases can behave depending on the real-world category the noun belongs to. This usually manifests itself in the choice of the type 2 and type 4 suffixes you would use. To pick 2 examples, that's the ones at the top. Tenwal shud is a blue page. Telwal memad shuddak means on our blue pages. Achen chul is a wise master. Achen putma chulvad is for our wise masters. The alternation between me and pu and maj and ma indicates information about what kind of noun this is. Tenwal, page, is a generic general noun, and achen is a noun referring to a being who is capable of using language. There's also a third category used for parts of the bodies of people and animals. Note that the verbs should, be blue, and chul, be wise here, which are used like adjectives, but are technically still verbs, because as we'll see in a moment, they take verbal prefixes and suffixes, but they do not agree with the category and morphology of the noun, the way that Russian adjectives must. Many languages on Earth, such as Cherokee, Nahuatl, Aztec, Finnish, and Hungarian, like the example here with the Reddit guy, exhibit similar nominal structures, but it's rare to get the option of shoving all of this information onto one word. Klingon verbs are even more morphologically complex, consisting of a prefix, which encodes both the pronominal subject and object of the verb, the root, and a set of up to 9 specifically ordered suffix elements, plus a class of suffixes whose order is more free. So to illustrate from the verb yaj, to understand, we get yajchuk, the root, plus the type 1 suffix, which means they understand each other. From chet, to run, to reign, to rule, we get chet-chet-rupka. Y'all are ready to rule us again. Prefix, root, type 2, type 3. Should, be blue, becomes lushud mochlach bej. They can definitely make it blue. Prefix, root, 4, 5, 6. And chul, to be wise, is bichul tachnish. Are you still being wise, my lord or my lady? Prefix, root, 7, 8, 9. So suffice to say, the way that Klingon arranges concepts very compactly into single nouns and verbs is deliberately designed to be radically different from the way that many languages familiar to the general American movie-going public work. This is a language supposedly spoken by hostile, prickly, warlike aliens in space, ideas that are normally experienced via auxiliaries like need, willingness, change, resumption, cause, ability, evidence, continuity, termination, and even respect or deference to the listener can all be reflected in a single word. But one thing Klingon verbs lack is tense. Jerat can mean I remain, I remained, I did remain, I will remain, etc. But it is up to the listener or reader to determine the time frame of an action or state based on external information. Dunny verbs, on the other hand, are again much more comfy and approachable from the perspective of an Indo-European speaker. A series of suffixes indicates the pronominal suffix of the verb. or the pronominal subject of the verb. The null suffix or zero suffix indicates the first person singular. So jicha is I remain, jicha em, you remain, jicha en, etc. Unlike Klingon, Dunny verbs take prefixes to indicate an inventory of tenses. These can be combined in most cases. Kokan read, I thought. Bokinoen, you will fail. Topogaten, she is ruling. Letagilet, we have understood. Kodomishtati, you all were constructing, etc. So in this domain, Dunny is much more agglutinative. That is, the tense and person markers are their own discrete, stackable morphemes rather than fusional affixes like Russian that contain all the information all at once. We should also note that Dunny nouns are like Klingon nouns in that they do not have grammatical gender, but they also do not exhibit any other kind of formal noun class. So there is likewise no agreement with adjectives. So we have bortrel, which is a blue page, febortiotrel, on our blue pages, Nava gedanet, is a wise master, Chenavatiot gedanet, for our wise masters. There are some similarities and differences in the structure of the noun phrase between Dunny and Klingon. The English prepositional meanings are expressed in Dunny as prefixes, in Klingon as suffixes, but both languages use suffixes for pronominal possession. Dunny also departs from its muse Hebrew, in that Hebrew does not have grammatical gender, masculine and feminine, and its adjectives must agree with their nouns in gender and number. Before we move into syntax, which is roughly speaking the way that sentences and clauses are composed of words, let's say a few things about compounding and the way that words might be formed from pre-existing parts. Both Klingon and Dunny in their official canonical form have generated new nouns from more than one noun and from a noun and a verb. So in Klingon we have vokship, literally choke gas for nitrogen, yinship, life gas for oxygen, anorkhed, fossil science, paleontology, anortej, fossil scientist, paleontologist, shakdak, landing site, and shak there is a verb, not a noun. But as a feature of real-world IRL Klingon speaking culture, we strongly discourage each other from coining new compounds, although we are free to create new noun phrases, since you can stick any number of nouns together in a grammatical noun phrase. So, for instance, there is no currently canonical way to refer to the concept of X-ray crystallography in Klingon, which is the scientific technique, real-world scientific technique, of bombarding a crystal structure with X-rays to determine the arrangement of its molecules. This is how the helical shape of the DNA molecule was discovered. But we do have Ray 60 crystal for the purpose of scanning technique process step, which is a perfectly reasonable way to refer to this process. I would surmise that pretty much any random advanced Klingon speaker would be enough of a nerd to recognize it. What we can't do is mash all of these words into one long word without spaces. That would be considered both anti-canonical and unclear. So Dunny also seems to allow for extensive compounding, but Dunny is distinct from Klingon in that it has a separate class of words which are true adjectives. Klingon adjectives are morphologically just verbs, as we've noted. So we have Shitem Sultan, messenger, message deliver agent, Partavo, the great Tavo, which is a unit of timekeeping. It's just a bigger Tavo. Anotam, water fire, is lava. Bivdil, all thing, is everything. Rilrov, not person, nobody. With the Shitem Sutam example, I'll point out a feature that both Hebrew and Dunny actually seem to share, if perhaps accidentally. Often in a complex noun phrase in Hebrew, the first noun will take on a certain special form if it is the possessed or associated element in a possessive relation. So you see the beast of a field, a family of peace, a woman of heart, a man's mare. The first noun is, the ending on the first noun is different from the same noun in the second one. In the Dunny construct form, if we can call it that, the compound form might be more appropriate. Often deletes whole syllables to fit succinctly into the final word, or else there is a change in the eternal vowels, which is very reminiscent of Hebrew. So we have Shia, which is short for Shitem Yavo, messenger of Yavo, angelic being. Tolesa, from Tolasa, a sealed place, a vault. Korvach, from Korbech, a linking book. And Lifo, from Vailifa, month 1, the first month of the Dunny calendar. The distinctness of the irregular way these nouns are modified for compounding adds uniqueness to Dunny grammar. It goes beyond the original inspirations and does its own thing. It's not just a snow clone of Hebrew. Dunny also allows for the compounding of verbs, pradges, stone art, to sculpt, do shol, food prepare, cater, fenges, story art, act, play a role. Whereas besides the panoply of suffixes and the ability to adjust and tinker with the meaning of a verb, Klingon only has a very few examples of verbs that are more than one syllable, let alone one morpheme. So ripdij, court-martial, from botdij, court of law. Chetshol, to stink, from chet, to smell like something. And these are the only ones. Those are the only two polysyllabic verbs in Klingon. I think there might be one more, but it's not a compound. While we're on the subject of nouns becoming verbs, here we'll pivot and point out that in many languages, nouns and verbs can be converted, so to speak, from one to the other with relative ease, depending on the particular word. In both Dunny and Klingon, verb to noun is much better attested than noun to verb, though theoretically there are ways of converting nouns to adjectives to verbs to Dunny. I won't go through all of these examples, but suffice to say, Dunny has a rich set of options for class shift, is what this is called. In Klingon, you have one option. You can turn a verb into a noun. There's one suffix that can go onto a Klingon verb, rach, which fits in the 9th slot in the sequence of suffixes, which turns a verbal form into a noun. But for stylistic reasons, it is almost never applied to a bare verb stem. Rach forms are sometimes the best way of expressing an idea, but generally they are to be avoided if possible. It's considered better style to try to use words within the bounds of known parts of speech when translating from English, which does not shy away from creating abstract nouns for ordinary discourse. So the verb ritl is to write. Ritlrup means they are ready to write. It's a full sentence. Ritlrup rach means readiness to write as a noun. Puv is the verb to fly. Puv vip is the sentence. They are afraid to fly. And puv vip rach means fear of flying. But forms like ritl rach and puv rach sound odd to Klingon ears without other suffixes. It would be like saying ritation or flydom. So rach is not a universal condiment. You can't put it on anything. In English, just to drive this point home about Klingon style and how Klingon style is different because of the fact that you don't have this free class shift. You might utter a sentence like, the council's wisdom and prudence led to the prosperity of the city's businesses. In Klingon, that would be Chul rip ejvach yoj medaj vaj chep veng maljatme. Literally, that's, the council was wise and its judgments were effective, so the city's businesses prospered. So there's a tendency in Klingon to fall back on full clauses and verbal phrases when English or Dunny might use noun phrases because of the restrictions Klingon has on class shift. So now that we've seen our first complex Klingon sentence, this seems like a good point to pivot into syntax at the level of the sentence. Here again, we'll see that Dunny is much more intuitive and approachable. As we've noted, Dunny is very much typologically like a familiar European-style language with nouns, verbs, adjectives, prepositions, and adverbs. Syntactically and idiomatically, it operates very much like English, with one exception. Adjectives and numbers, I guess that's two exceptions, tend to come after the noun they modify. Remishtav robotril marenten resetikag. The actual construction does not follow the original designs. Relenagath shentoen blo yarti sen futugo. The journey still takes about 3 days on foot. This sentence is a great illustration because it includes structures that are very foreign to English. Days 3 instead of 3 days, and also very idiomatically similar to English. Futugo literally means on foot. If you wanted to say that in Klingon, you'd have to express that you were walking, since kamdak, on foot, literally means at the location of the foot, or inside the foot, or something like that. So, to say that sentence in Klingon, you'd say Rinmechleng, wej jaj puchtach kam vewi. The journey still takes about 3 days on foot. So the journey can be finished. A foot traveler still requires 3 days. So you have to kind of rearrange the concepts a little bit. You have to recast the sentence, is what we say. Note that the plural number on jaj, day, is optional. You can say wej jaj or wej jajme for 3 days. Plurals are never required. Let's revisit the first sentence in Klingon. The construction does not follow the actual construction does not follow the original designs. In English and Dunny, the subject of a sentence tends to come at the beginning and the object comes at the end. The way these ideas have to be phrased is peculiar to the vocabulary that exists in Klingon and the morphological limitations that have existed in the language from the beginning. Klingon is backwards. The subject comes at the very end and the object comes first. There's a word for origin in Klingon, mung, but as you'll recall, that unlike Dunny, there's no good way to turn a noun into an adjective, or a verb for that matter, because as you recall, in Klingon, adjectives don't exist. Instead of directly saying original, you have to go with the next best idea, so to speak, which is watich, the word for first, from wat meaning one. There's a similar issue with the word say, design. There's a verb in Klingon that means to design something, ren, and a renwi is a designer or an architect. But there's no noun meaning design as a noun. So instead of saying the original design, you have to say something like kornabwatich, the first structure plan. Klingon does have a verb similar to marint in Dunny, which means to follow or conform to, and that verb is pab, which is especially used in cases of following rules or protocols or obeying the law. There is a related noun pab, but it specifically refers to the concept of grammar, as in the grammar of a language or perhaps a computer programming language. The bet suffix is a simple negative, so x pabet y means y does not conform to x. Lastly, the subject of the sentence we've rendered as multaqaj for the actual construction. The word gherid is a noun and refers to the result or consequence of something. It's a second noun or head noun, and in a noun-noun phrase, the first noun is multaqaj, one of the rare Klingon gerunds I mentioned earlier. It's a qaj form. It's derived from the verb mutl, which means to craft or assemble something. To say that you're a craftsperson or that you practice some trade by working with your hands, you would call yourself a mutlwit. The suffix ta encodes the fact that the action is complete and that it was completed on purpose. So multa indicates an act of construction that is purposeful and complete. So to recap, the result of the construction did not follow the rules of the first structure plan. Or, more naturally, the actual construction did not follow the original design. We'll do one more classic example from Guildsman Atris's map. Remla sechin point bonuets brigasen. The lizard has highly acidic saliva. In Klingon, this would be pe chuku lung tlepche. Note that there are no morphemes like re, meaning the definite article. The concept of definiteness, a lizard versus the lizard, does not exist in Klingon, just as in Russian and Latin. Here we run into the same problem again. We have a noun for acid, pe, but no way of converting it into an adjective or verbal descriptor. But that's all right, because we have the verb chew, which means to epitomize, to exude, to embody, or more prosaically, to possess the quality of something. In the original Dunny sentence, the verbal focus is on what the lizard has, that is, highly acidic saliva. In Klingon, we zoom in on the saliva itself. It's a very colorful example, and how it epitomizes, typifies, and manifests the nature of acid. The ku suffix is an intensifier, pretty much just means very. Klingons are culturally precise, but do not specify intensities with actual numbers on a scale of 1 to 25, the way the Dunny do. Brigatsen literally means to 20 and 3. So through these examples, you can kind of get the sense of how much easier and more approachable it is to have an artificial language like Dunny that allows you to basically plug in English word order, more or less, as opposed to Klingon, which because of its inflexibility forces you into these stylistic choices, which are sometimes poetic. But teaching Klingon stylistics is a whole other dimension of skill that those who do teach the language, like myself, have to impart to advanced learners, simply because we have no adjectives and no prepositions and no reliable way of turning nouns into verbs and so on. But that leads to another issue. It's true that part of the fun of using Klingon is solving puzzles, finding ways of counterintuitively expressing ourselves using a limited grammar and vocabulary. But we might ask, are there some things that you just can't say in Klingon, or at least say with relative certainty that an intelligent fellow speaker will understand you? The answer to that question is, of course, yes. There's a lot that we can talk about with the tools we have, as the X-ray crystallography example shows. If we can understand what something fundamentally is and describe it, we're basically in good shape. But there are some things, mostly mathematical and scientific concepts, which are so abstract and complicated and divorced from an everyday sense of understanding, and yet they make up a fundamental part of our world. that we speakers of natural languages resort to creative and culturally specific metaphors to describe them. A good example of this might be the concept of dark matter, which is an astronomical phenomenon appropriate for Klingons because they're space aliens. Dark matter is physical stuff. It's matter that's out there, apparently in large quantities in space, but which we Earthlings can't see with our telescopes or other instruments. We know that it's out there because the matter that we know about, the stars and galaxies and so on, the bright matter doesn't fully account for the gravitational interactions we can observe in deep space. So astronomers assume that there's something out there, even if we can't see it, and that's something we provisionally call dark matter. As of July of 2025, there is no official word for dark matter in Klingon. But wait, we have a word for dark in Klingon. It's hur. And we have a word for matter, chap. So isn't this a non-issue? Can't we just say chap hur? Won't people understand what we say when we say this? Well, they probably will, but remember that the point of Klingon is to simulate not only linguistic expression, but also the fictional culture that goes along with it. And the darkness of dark matter is simply our shorthand Earthling metaphor for the fact that we just can't see this mysterious stuff with a telescope. It just doesn't interact with light, whatever it is. So in Klingon, we could just as easily call it chapadim, transparent matter, or chapra, diaphanous matter, see-through matter. And it would be just as accurate as the English metaphor. So that's the dilemma. How do you describe something that's clearly, observably everywhere in the universe that Klingons would know about and be able to talk about in a way that doesn't presuppose the way that a human being might think about it? Well, Klingon speakers might disagree with each other about questions like this, but there is one thing we all agree on. Mark Okrand is the one who did the original design work for Klingon for 40 years. He's the authoritative source for what officially, canonically gets to be considered a Klingon word. And so every year, for the past 30 years, he's graciously listened to our suggestions, and every year he gives us, on average, about 100 to 120 new words and phrases. The two major Klingon fan clubs, one based in the United States and the other based in Europe, maintain lists of these suggestions that are collected and voted on and prioritized by members in good standing. But of course, Mark O has the final say as to what words get in, what they will look like, what sounds or concepts will be used. So you know how I said that there is no official word for dark matter in Klingon? Well, that was true until about 1 week ago. The words in this list are new Klingon words, barely a week old, newly revealed by Mark as a result of community feedback. So we have chitner, placenta, hurchap, dark matter, which actually means background matter, outside matter. So it sounds sort of like chap hur, but it's actually background matter. Two, to hover. Chorish, carbohydrate. Lautwan, inertia. View, be sacrosanct, etc., etc. Durchop, proboscis. As you can see, a lot of these are scientific or technical. I tell people that we're in the long tail phase of vocabulary creation because for most of the everyday normal stuff, we already have the basic necessary words. So, in the production of new words year upon year, the process in which we in the community discuss with each other whether this word should be included or that word, we navigate both the territory of the underlying science fiction narrative and the practical considerations of what it is already possible to say. It seems well in keeping with the progressive, futuristic values of Star Trek to boldly go where no one has gone before. Languages like Esperanto are already very successful at incorporating new vocabulary to be able to talk about virtually anything, because Esperanto can just borrow a Latin or Greek or Germanic word. But Klingon is exceptional because it is spoken by fictional aliens, and so any word that Okrand might coin cannot deliberately resemble any word from Earth. So, as you might expect, the Dunny language also has its share of unsolved mysteries. Klingon is concerned with ways to say things, the best way forward as to how to express increasingly complex technical concepts. But there are some words in the canonical Dunny corpus appearing in official Cyan releases whose meaning we do not know. Either the meaning is entirely unknown or can only be guessed at. So, for example, in Gen's journal we read, Kolobira ratijakar. I was keeping the original blank. We aren't sure what tija means, but we can read later in the same document, Kokenen revog miro och revida, mot kopuguen beken erth nadata barish beerth tija tigal kera. It was the toxic nature of the atmosphere that blanked to be a serious Y to a brave working blank. The fact that tija refers to something that can work, tig, And be brave, kera, suggests that it is a person or group of people, and the Dunny archivist known as Chrestrifa, whose work I've used extensively throughout this presentation, surmises that tija might mean a crew or squad of people. In the second sentence down, Chrestrifa also speculates that the unknown verb pugo might mean prove, and that the unknown noun nudatav, presumably derived from the verb nada, might mean something like hinder, get in the way. So the whole sentence would mean, it was the toxic nature of the atmosphere that proved a substantial hindrance to a brave working squad, which seems like a pretty solid guess to me, given that we know that this journal entry is concerned with Gen constructing his office on age 233. But in the same document, we also read, Real Bodo Papil, I will not have been blanking. There really isn't enough contextual information to determine what this might mean, even if we take into account the previous clause. We can't make a definitive call about what gedi and mushi mean either, so how we might choose to gloss papil remains obscure. And the fact that there are dozens more of these words attested in the official corpus of Dunny documents for which no meaning can be deduced from the available evidence, a tantalizing state of affairs which only deepens the mystery and mystique of a supposedly lost civilization like the Dunny. And speaking of civilization, we now turn our attention finally to perhaps the most sophisticated thing that you can do with language, which is literature. Over the course of this talk, we've gone from the cultural background of how these artificial language structures emerged, the real-world economic, philosophical, historical, and even ideological inspirations for these two languages to the micro level of composition, how sounds make up morphemes, that is, roots and affixes, how morphemes make up words, how words make up phrases, how phrases make up sentences, and the dynamics of how those sentences mean what they mean. And now at the home stretch, we're finally at the macro level. Again, inquiring about what it might look like to have a body of long-form literature in an artificial language. Again, the most prominent example of this phenomenon is Esperanto, which has been around for almost 150 years. If you learn Esperanto, you can read dozens of titles, like both Testaments of the Bible, Jane Eyre, Gulliver's Travels, Murder on the Orient Express, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, 1984, and The Alchemist. You can also read Shakespeare, an author who has a very special relationship with the Klingon language. Ever since a certain tongue-in-cheek throwaway line in Star Trek VI, spoken by Chancellor Gorkon, the Klingon Gorbachev, that implied that Shakespeare's works were originally composed in Klingon. Taking this as a challenge to be accepted, the Klingon Language Institute, then a relatively new organization, prepared the first long literary translation in the Klingon language, Shakespeare's Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark, in 1996. Which is kind of crazy when you think about how challenging that text is in English. It is Shakespeare's longest play, and I dare say, often crucially misunderstood. Before that, the longest published texts were the KLI's periodical poetry journal, Jatme. But after Hamlet, since 1996, you can read Gilgamesh, Much Ado About Nothing, The Tao Te Ching, The Art of War, The Little Prince, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Alice in Wonderland, and The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And these are just the longer books. You can also download in ebook form a number of Hugo and Nebula award-winning short stories translated by the advanced membership of the KLI. So that's Klingon. As for Dunny, well, like I said, what we have is tantalizing. We have some journal entries and incidental dialogue in the novels, toponyms, place names, words released for Lexember on Science Twitter, or I guess it's Blue Sky now, despite the fact that the Dunny's whole civilization is based on writing and the literal reification of literary theory, we don't have anything longer than about 15 sentences as a text in the Dunny language, which is a shame and a challenge, because Dunny is aesthetically well-designed, historically and intellectually deep-rooted, and approachable, easier than Spanish. And since Cyan produces fine branded merchandise in addition to puzzle games, I think I speak for quite a few people in this room when I say that I would pay top dollar for Mist the Book of Atris Dunny edition. Monolingual Dunny special edition in hardback for the collectors. A guy can dream. Anyway, if you're curious about what a contemporary literary translation in an artificial language looks like, there's a new Klingon translation of the first Sherlock Holmes story, A Scandal in Bohemia, released by the German publishing concern Eggput Verlag, translated by some guy with a boring name. Available via special order where all fine books are sold. You guys have been a fantastic audience. Thank you so much. Enjoy Mysterium. Enjoy the weekend. Thank you.
So I know we have a few questions. I guess one, and we have one online. Lutra is going to be our initial here, and we'll go from there.
I have a question from Everett DePanger in Discord.
Okay.
As far as I know, Denis consistently follows its own phonetic pronunciation rules. Infamously, English does not. How realistic is it for a language to maintain Denis consistency?
That's an excellent question. Usually, it's when you standardize a language, at the moment of standardization, that's when you have the greatest fidelity to the writing system. Over time, like the longer time elapses, the more you have like historical change in the way a language is pronounced. So it's realistic, it's realistic if you live in Turkey in the 1930s when they totally revamped the writing system, right? It's not realistic for a language like English, whose system of spelling and standardization was established in the days of William Caxton, before Shakespeare. So it's a complex question, but that's basically it. It's more likely that a language will be pronounced as it's written if we're closer in time historically to the moment of standardization.
Another from Discord, Bastico P. How optimistic are you that entire novels can be composed in or translated into Denis?
I don't know. That depends on a lot of factors beyond my control.
Fair enough. Audience questions?
I would love that.
Oh,
That
we
would
have
be
a lot
awesome.
of audience questions. Cool. Up right here.
Thank you. So I had a question. I've always noticed that Dunny had a lot to do with Hebrew and Aramaic languages. I was reading some information on Old Sumer before Babylonian Empire and noticed several instances where a lot of the ideas and processes of language was used in cuneiform. I don't know if you were aware of that.
Yeah.
Also, if indeed it is based on Hebrew and ancient Sumerian, Aramaic, it would be, in my opinion, as if I could translate all that, fairly easy to do a book or anything else in the Dunny language.
It would be a fan work, right? It wouldn't be like you would have to establish some kind of relationship with Cyan if you wanted to get the thing, branded and all of that stuff. Like I'm sure that as a fan work, I don't know the ins and outs of the legalese of what you might do. I think that if you didn't, as long as you didn't sell it as as long as you didn't make any money from it, I think you'd be okay. That's a different question. Klingon is a bit different for reasons I won't go into, but yeah, you could do that. That's something that you could manage. Like as a fan production, you could absolutely do that. You could certainly do that. You could create your own words, but the question is, would other people accept those words, right? So that's the primary issue.
Okay. Oh, goodness.
Burning language questions.
Oh, yes.
Dotona le Tagamen Denis.
Cam?
How long have you known Denis?
Maybe a long time, since the 90s for sure. Yeah. All right.
Circling back a little to the how well Dunny has stayed linguistically, quote unquote, pure. Something that popped in my head was how certain languages around here, like French, they have like actual bureaucracy established to try and maintain linguistic fidelity. This is more of a cultural question than a linguistic question, I suppose, but is the implication, given how relatively structurally, quote unquote, pure Dunny still is, and the nature of writing being this major social and political and just socially central thing for their culture, is it likely they literally have some sort of organization that's basically keeping their linguistic nature relatively static over all these centuries that they were extant?
That's a great question. So we know that they had a guild of linguists. We don't know everything that they did. Presumably they did a lot of field work in the ages, right? Like, I imagine that's what a lot of what they did was. I mean, they were like sociologically, they were, very, they had a guild system running their culture. So I imagine that was one of the things that the Guild of Linguists would have done is like, they put out the MLA handbook of style, Like, I imagine, like, that's what I, imagine in my head canon is that was one function of the Guild of Linguists. So that's realistic. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good surmise. I agree with that.
Hey,
Please continue.
Yes, I was just wondering, have you seen the movie Arrival? And if you have, what are your thoughts on the alien language from that
So
film?
People who know that this is what I do, they ask me about the film quite a bit. I think that, like, I like the movie. It's cool, but I think if aliens or if you develop interstellar travel, when you get here, you're just going to set up your AI in the atmosphere and pick up all the radio signals and just figure out how to speak English. And you're just going to speak English to us. Like, that's literally, I think, what's going to happen. Like, if you're that advanced where, like, you can park your spaceship in the atmosphere, you're going to have computer systems and technology way beyond anything we've ever seen. Like, if faster than light thing is a thing you can do, like, you're going to have no problem talking English or Chinese or, like, Arabic to us. Like, it's going to be nothing. So that's my take on how realistic it would be. But it's a good movie. It's a cool movie. It's, yeah, unless they wanted to throw down the gauntlet.
I don't know if you played Abduction or not.
I have not, unfortunately.
In Abduction, there are other alien species that have that have their own forms of language, but it's like forms of language that are so different as to not actually be mutually usable between species at all at a physical level.
Sure.
Not possible. Sure. Like sounds that not all species can make and such like that. What was I trying to get at with that?
Is it realistic? Is that possible? Like, is that actually? Are you asking about whether that's actually possible?
I'm trying to organize my thoughts on it. Like, what? Do you have any ideas on like what sort of approach one would take in actually trying to bridge that gap in the first place?
Sure. So if that's a situation sort of like the movie Arrival, where they have to figure out, like, okay, they've got 7 tentacles, these beings, and they move them around, and that's how they do what we do with our vocal tract. You would just apply the principles of basic informatics, right? You say, okay, like what's a bit of information with 7 tentacles? Like, you would have to break it down to that level. Anything like, I guess technically like radio waves, you could think if there's some being out there, that communicates via radio waves, like, that would be a medium of communication. It all depends on the medium and the nature of the medium. So
there's another thing I just remembered. So one of the alien species basically is one that is already that is already more capable, more adept at actually picking up other languages, but it becomes a sort of a plot point that they're actually very good at picking up words using identifying, but end up falling down on actually on actually figuring out a consistent grammatical structure because they're trying to pick up multiple languages that don't have the same structure. Is sorry, I'm trying to
That's
organize
okay.
myself.
If you guys want to come up and talk to me anytime, like during the convention, we can you know. A lot of this stuff is really complicated too. It's you know, I came here to give, you know, a real lecture on with real linguistics. So this is hard stuff. Like it's hard for me. You know, like I have a degree, so
Thank you.
it's very difficult. Yeah, we'll talk later. You'll talk later.
And we're pretty much at time here. Do you want to wrap? Might be a little too far away from the receiver there, so we're going to walk a little bit this way. We did have one follow-up question of whether or not during any downtime would you be willing to do any like light reading from your book so we can hear you read
Sure.
it?
Yeah, no problem. No
Sure. All right. Well, if anybody might be interested in that, maybe we can have a little corner thing happen for that. But sure. Why not? All right. So let's give Andrew a huge thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. Awesome questions. Thank you.
Yeah.